David Nasaw, you are an academic historian who specializes in cultural and social history of the early 20th century. You have written numerous scholarly and popular books, and you have written for most of America's prestigious publications, and also you have appeared in several documentaries. And today we're here to speak about your latest book, The Last Million, Europe's Displaced Persons from World War to Cold War. David, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
So David, I mean, you have devoted your life to study history and sharing it with us, in particular 20th century history. But I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your history. How did you stumble upon this path?
My God, I don't quite know. I guess in college, I had some extraordinary professors who taught history, and I began to understand or to believe that the only way we can understand, and this sounds like a cliche, but I think there's some truth to it, as there is to many cliches, that the only way we can understand where we are today is to understand how we got here. And that the past isn't dead and gone, it lives on. When I teach my undergraduates and my graduate students, I always go back to the Clint Eastwood moment where he takes a gun and he points it at the bad guy and he says, "Your history," and he shoots him. And I said, well, that's wrong. That's wrong. Because history is not dead and over at any moment. It lives with us in the present. So I suppose that's how this all came about. I wanted to understand not only the present, not only where we are and how we got here, but I wanted to look at the paths not taken, the alternate journeys that mankind in general, Americans in particular, might have taken. Those paths that were closed off and why they were closed off.
Wow. There's a movie in Netflix or Amazon, which is the version of how America would have been shaped if the Nazis would have won the war. So that is an alternative reality. And of course, you are right. And oftentimes, the things that change our present are small accidents of history that transform everything else. We could have been, instead of having an American flag, we could have a, who knows, maybe a Nazi flag. We don't know. It could have been possible. But okay, so you had an amazing, good professor who arose that interest in history. And I feel like history is taught with dates and facts, and most is not taught with a storytelling tilt. And most students get bored because they don't want to memorize dates and name, and they just want to move on with their life. But you teach history, so can you suggest a way in which people could be more engaged in history and studying the past?
Well, I am terrible on dates, you know, and I'm terrible on names. I think it's important to look at the larger picture, to look at the landscape. If you want to, instead of painting a portrait of an individual, and I do this even in my biographies, I want to put that individual, whether he or she is famous or unknown, in the larger picture. Look, we have no choice as to who our parents are, or to where we're born, or to whether we are born into a poor family or a rich family. But history of an individual and of a society is how do we take what's given us as an individual or as a group or as a society and move somewhere else with it. hopefully to a better world. Human beings are the only animals that can envision a future. We can envision a future and then try to work towards it. And I think that's part of what I try to do with my students. And it works. It works. History is storytelling. It's narrative. And there is nothing more fascinating than stories, real stories of the past. I often get upset. You know, I want to go into every bookstore I've ever walked into, and I want to take the shelves that are marked nonfiction and remove that nonfiction. I don't want history to be compared to fiction. I want stories of the real and stories of the imagination. Now, that doesn't mean that historians don't have an imagination. We have to put together these stories, but we attempt to get it real.
Right.
And
Okay.
that's what I try to do with my students, and it works, I think.
So, so you are teaching history, and at a given moment, you decide to start writing books. Can you tell us why? I mean, writing books is just a different profession, and it's a brain-consuming profession, and teaching is also quite busy.
Yeah. I don't think that anyone should, well, I don't want to make, you know, big statements here. But let me just say that for me as a historian, I couldn't teach history unless I was doing it, unless I was writing it, unless I was creating it. It just didn't seem right to me to be I mean, the best teachers are doers, and the best doers are teachers. And if I'm going to teach history, I also want to be writing history. I want to be creating history. So from the very beginning, I researched and I wrote as I taught. And I took into the classroom the process that I was going through. Because I want students to know, I wanted students to know that there's no one true account. There's no definitive biography, a definitive history. We're always rewriting history as we go along. And I could best demonstrate that to my students by talking about what I was working on as I was working on it.
Wow, amazing. Okay, so then what is it that piqued your interest to write about the last million?
One of the things that historians do, or that I try to do, is to fill in the gaps and complicate our understanding, our knowledge of what happened before we were born and before the present moment. And I came to realize while writing and after writing my biography of Joseph Kennedy, the father of the president and the senator, or the president and two senators, I came to realize that World War II, for millions and millions and millions of people, didn't end with the cessation of hostilities in Europe and then in Japan. That war does not end with peace treaties. That war does not end even when the soldiers go home. And I wanted to tell the story of Europe and America and the rest of the world, how it dealt with the victims of war, the innocent victims of war, and some of the collaborators with the Nazis and war criminals when the war was over. Again, when hostilities ceased in Germany, there were millions of non-Germans who were left in that nation, all but the last million, the title of my book, went home. The last million could not go home again, either because, like the Jewish survivors, they had no homes to go back to, or like many of the Poles, they were afraid to go back to a country that was now dominated by a communist party allied with the Soviet Union, or like a large number of the Ukrainians, and a minority of the Latvians, Lithuanians, and Estonians. They had collaborated in some way with the Nazi regime and were afraid if they returned, whether they had committed crimes or not, they would be accused of collaboration and punished for it. So these disparate groups end up in Germany when the war is over. And the United Nations organization, this is before there is a United Nations, but there's a United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Agency. And its job is to take care of these displaced persons until they go home again. Well, 1 million of them don't want to go home again. So my story is what happens to them? What happens to them from 1945 to 1950, 1951?
Wow. You so out of these displaced persons, you mentioned that there are three groups: the Poles, who are forced labor, the Lithuanians, and then the Jews. Can you tell us more in detail who are these groups and how they ended up to be being displaced?
Absolutely. When the Nazi high command believed wrongly that the war was going to be over right away, that the Red Army would fold, that the Brits would say, we give up, you're too strong, the war would be over and all the soldiers would come home. The opposite happened. Very early on, by 1941, Hitler and the German high command realized that they were going to be stuck. They were going to have millions and millions and millions of able-bodied men stuck on the Eastern Front fighting the Red Army for years to come. Now, in order to maintain a nation back in Germany, they had to replace those million men, those several million men. They had to replace them on the farms. They had to replace them in the fields, in the mines, in the factories. And what did they do? The Nazis virtually kidnapped millions of Eastern Europeans, mostly Poles and Ukrainians, and they brought them into Germany to take the jobs that had been left behind by the soldiers. These were forced laborers. Some were slave laborers. They were Untermenschen. They were third-class citizens. They weren't allowed to go to church. They weren't allowed to eat. They weren't allowed to fraternize with the Aryans, with the Germans. So there were millions of them. When the war is over, there are 400,000 Poles who had been brought to Germany, most of them as adolescents, as teenagers. And they don't know what to do. Do they go home to a nation that's been just devastated by war? Or do they try to make a life for themselves in Germany? The second group are the Estonians, the Latvians, the Lithuanians, and some Ukrainians. And unlike the Poles who would come into Germany at the beginning of the war, these groups, the Baltics, didn't get into Germany till the end of the war. And why? Why? Because they had cooperated, collaborated, worked with the Germans. And when the war was over, they recognized that the only safe place for them would be in Germany. because of their collaboration. Now, a lot of these people were innocent of any war crimes. I mean, if you were a Latvian, I tell the story of a Latvian woman who worked in the post office. I mean, she had worked in the post office before the Nazis came in. She worked after the Nazis came in. I tell the story of Estonians who worked in the waterworks or kept the sewers running or delivered food. Well, once the Nazis came in, they had to work for Nazis. That made them collaborators. And they were afraid that the Red Army and a Soviet regime was going to punish them. So they fled into Germany. Now, with them, there were a minority who were real war criminals. And they should have been punished if they stayed behind. And they fled to save their lives.
Wow.
And the third group are the Jews. You know, at the end of the war, the Nazis don't want any hint left behind of what they had done to the Jews. The Nazis tried to erase evidence of the death camps, of the concentration camps. And they take the surviving Jews and other political prisoners who were in Auschwitz and other camps, and they put them on cattle cars into trucks, or they death march them back into Germany. And for the Jews, they are returned by the Nazis to Germany, not to save their lives, but to change the manner of their death. Instead of being gassed, they're going to be worked to death in the underground armaments factories that Hitler believes are going to produce weapons to save, to end the war. They are part of the last million. And there's one other group of Jews. 80 to 90% of the Polish Jews who survived the war did so because they escaped into the Soviet Union, where they spent the war years at hard work in the Asiatic reaches of the Soviet Union, in Kazakhstan, thousands of miles from Poland. When the war is over, Stalin returns them to Poland. They come back to Poland and they realize that the anti-Semitism is such that the violence is such, the pogroms are such, that they can't stay in Poland.
Wow.
And 200,000 of these survivors end up in the displaced persons camps in Germany.
And so these 200,000 to 250,000, according to your book, nobody wants to take them. The United States
No.
don't want to take them. Why they don't want to take them? I mean, I mean, today we want to amend as much as possible. I want to show sympathy and understanding, but at that time, what was wrong with them?
In 1945, 46, 47, 48, through 1950, anti-Semitism had not disappeared with the death of Hitler and the overthrow of the Nazi regime. Anti-Semitism in the United States and in Canada and in Australia and in England had just changed its shape. So nobody was going to use the same words that Hitler had used, but there was a new fear, a new myth, a new falsehood about the Jews. And that was because they had all come from Poland or spent the war years in the Soviet Union. They were probably communists. This is an old myth that goes back to the Bolshevik Revolution. When the Pope said, the Bolshevik Revolution was the Judeo-Bolshevik Revolution. Hitler had said the same things over and over and over again. And those lies continued to be spread and believed. In the United States of America, Congress made a decision. 3 years after the war was over, we're going to let in the Latvians. We're going to let in the Poles. We're going to let in the Ukrainians. We're going to let in all the Eastern Europeans, but not those who had entered the displaced persons camps after 1946. Who had entered the displaced persons camps after 1946? The Jews who had been in the Soviet Union. And they said, we can't let them in because there's security risks, because they're either sympathetic to the Soviets or they're communist agents. And we are in the midst of fighting a Cold War. The distance between World War and Cold War is infinitesimal. When the World War is over, the American Congress and the people of the Western world change enemies. Hitler becomes Stalin. The Gestapo becomes the KGB. The concentration camps become Siberia. The analogy is false from beginning to end. The Soviets are brutal, brutal, brutal people. A brutal government, not people. But they're not the Nazis. Nonetheless, when the war is over, the Jews are kept out.
Wow.
In the end, I argue in my book, the reason why Harry Truman, President Truman, recognizes the state of Israel minutes after the Declaration of Independence is not because, as the history books tell us, he was a Zionist or he had Jewish friends or he was a humanitarian or he read the Bible, but because he knew the only place on earth for the Jews was Israel. And he had to get him out of Germany, so that he could create an independent West German state that would be part of the anti-communist coalition.
Wow. Okay. So the state of Israel is created, which at the same time creates another set of circumstances which now displace thousands of Palestinians that are in that geographical area.
Absolutely. It is a crime. It's one crime upon another crime upon another crime. It is one of the ironies, the tragic ironies of history, that the only place for the displaced Jews was in homes, on settlements, in fields and farms that had once housed Palestinians who, for one reason or another, had fled in 1948 and whom the new Israeli government would not allow to return. So the Jewish displaced persons find a home, and for the past 80 years, almost 80 years, the Palestinians have been in refugee camps overlooked by another UN organization.
Wow. So history doesn't stop, as you said. It's alive. It continues to evolve, and as it is right now, there are millions of other displaced people. Who are the displaced people of today?
The displaced people that I talked to were, in the scheme of things, relatively fortunate. They were resettled. The Jews in Israel, the Latvians and the Ukrainians and everybody else in Canada and Australia and the United States and South America. They were resettled and they were eventually given citizenship. The displaced persons after World War II, the European displaced persons that I talk about, were all white, they were all European, and 75% of them were Christian. The displaced persons today have a much more difficult time getting the opportunity for settlement and citizenship because they are not white. They are not Christian. They do not have relatives in the United States or Canada who have the political know-how to lobby to get them into these countries and get them citizenship. And there are more of them than ever before. Franklin Roosevelt understood in 1943 that the only way to solve the displaced persons camps, the displaced persons problem that was going to rise after World War II, was for the nations of the world to come together, because this was a global problem and needed a global solution. That remains true today. And regrettably, under the last administration in the United States, the US, by withdrawing from all international agreements and all international groups supporting the resettlement of refugees, dealt a body blow to the attempts to solve these problems. So it's going to take longer, and it's going to take more understanding, and it's going to take more of the best in us, our humanitarian instincts, to solve this problem.
This is super interesting, David. I don't know what else to say. There are millions of people who are displaced, whether it's for war, for climate change causes, religion, whatever it is, and it is continue evolving. So I guess a good place to start is to start reading your book. Can you tell us one more time the title of the book and where people can follow you?
My name is David Nasaw, Nasaw. The book is entitled The Last Million, Europe's Displaced Persons from World War to Cold War. It's published by Penguin Press, and it's available wherever you buy your books, in your local bookshops, or from Barnes & Noble, or Bookshop, or Amazon, or any number of other outlets.
Professor Nasaw, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.